Everyone knows the story. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue and discovered America. But that story is only part of the truth, and maybe the least interesting part. Columbus didn't discover a continent that had been home to millions for thousands of years. He wasn't even the first European to set foot there. So why is his name the one schoolchildren memorize, and not Leif Erikson's, the Viking explorer who arrived centuries earlier? The truth is more complicated and more political than most history books let on. Leif Erikson, the son of Erik the Red, sailed from Greenland to what we now call Newfoundland around the year 1000. He and his crew found a place so full of grapes they called it Vinland. They built houses, stayed through the winter, and may have traded or fought with the people who already lived there. Archaeologists have found the remains of their settlement at a site called Landsaux Meadows, proving that Norse explorers crossed the Atlantic long before Columbus was even born. So why isn't Leif Erikson the discoverer of America in popular history? Partly because his story was almost lost. The Norse sagas that recorded his voyages were written down centuries after they happened, and for a long time, many Europeans didn't believe them. Columbus, on the other hand, lived in a time when printing presses and European politics spread news quickly. His voyage came at the perfect moment when European nations were hungry for new trade routes and new land to conquer. But there's another layer to this story. Columbus wasn't looking for a new continent at all. He thought he had reached Asia. He called the people he met Indians because he believed he was near India. And while textbooks often portray him as a brave hero, his expeditions were brutal. He enslaved indigenous people, forced them to work, and when they resisted, his men killed them. These are not just controversial footnotes, they were central to what Columbus did. Still, Columbus became a symbol, not just of exploration, but of European expansion. His voyages opened the door to centuries of colonization, conquest, and cultural collision. For European monarchs, that was worth celebrating. They wanted a hero, someone to justify their claims to the New World. Leif Erikson didn't serve that purpose. The Vikings never built empires in America. Their colonies failed, and they eventually abandoned their settlements. That's not the kind of story kings wanted to inspire their people. And so, history was written to favor Columbus. Statues went up. National holidays were created. Generations were taught to see him as the man who changed the course of history. And in a way, he did, just not in the way we were told. His voyages sparked what historians now call the Columbian Exchange, or the massive transfer of plants, animals, diseases, and people between the old world and the new. It transformed diets, economies, and entire populations on both sides of the ocean. But that exchange came at a devastating cost. Diseases brought by Europeans wiped out up to 90% of indigenous populations in some areas. Whole civilizations were destroyed before Europeans even arrived in their cities, simply because germs traveled faster than ships. This part of the story rarely made it into school textbooks, because it complicates the narrative of heroic discovery. So when we ask, who really discovered America? The answer depends on what we mean by discovery. Is it the first human to set foot on the continent tens of thousands of years ago? The first European to arrive? The first one whose voyage changed the world forever? The truth is, America has been discovered many times, by many peoples, and each discovery meant something different. Asterisk, if you want to understand why Columbus became the face of the discovery, you have to look at who told the story. History isn't just about what happened, it's about who had the power to write it down and spread it. In Columbus's time, Spain was rising as a global empire. The Spanish crown needed a figure to celebrate, a narrative that made them look like the chosen explorers of destiny. Columbus, despite his flaws, was perfect for that role. Leif Erikson didn't have a country backing his legacy. The Norse settlements in North America were small, isolated, and short-lived. By the time the sagas were finally written, the Viking Age was over. Norway, Iceland, and Greenland weren't global superpowers. There was no political reason to keep the memory of Vinland alive. So the story faded into near myth until archaeologists proved it centuries later. And there's something else, Columbus's voyages didn't just stay in history books. They reshaped the map of the world. European nations launched wave after wave of expeditions. Settlers followed soldiers. Entire empires were built on the idea that the land they found was theirs to take. That idea didn't just change America, it changed Europe, Africa, and Asia too. But if you look closer, you see that the discovery was also a collision. Two worlds that had been separate for thousands of years suddenly crashed together. It wasn't just new foods like corn and potatoes crossing the ocean, it was people, cultures, and belief systems. For the indigenous nations of the Americas, it was the beginning of an invasion that would erase languages, religions, and ways of life. That's why, for many, Columbus is not a hero but a symbol of oppression. In recent years, statues of him have been torn down. Some cities in the United States have replaced Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day. The debate is fierce, because for some, Columbus represents courage and human ambition, the spirit of exploration. For others, he represents violence and exploitation. Leif Erikson, in contrast, has become a kind of safe alternative. Celebrating him feels less controversial, partly because the Norse didn't colonize or enslave the same way Europeans later did. But even then, the Viking presence wasn't peaceful. The sagas mention fights with the locals, what they called Skrellings. There were likely moments of fear and bloodshed on both sides. Discovery was never a gentle handshake between civilizations. So maybe the real question isn't whether Columbus or Erikson discovered America first. Maybe the question is why we are so eager to find a single hero at all. Why do we reduce something as massive as the meeting of two continents into the story of one man and one date? History loves simple answers, but real history is rarely simple. Think about what it means to discover something. Does it only count if it's written in European languages? Does it count if millions of people were already living there? Does discovery mean first contact or lasting impact? And if we're honest, maybe the most important discovery wasn't made by either man. The real discovery was made by the civilizations who suddenly realized they were not alone. The Norse saw lands beyond the horizon and realized the ocean wasn't endless. Columbus's voyages showed Europe that there were continents they hadn't mapped, riches they hadn't claimed. And for the people already living in the Americas, the discovery was terrifying. They discovered that strangers had arrived who would change their lives forever. The story of America's discovery isn't just about two men separated by 5 centuries. It's about what happens when worlds collide, when human ambition meets uncharted territory, and when myths are stronger than memory. Columbus became the symbol because his journey didn't just find land, it triggered a chain reaction that transformed the globe. Crops like maize and potatoes crossed oceans and fueled population booms in Europe, Africa, and Asia. Horses, wheat, and smallpox crossed in the other direction, forever altering life in the Americas. But every chain reaction has its casualties. The civilizations that had built cities, trade networks, and empires long before Europeans arrived were devastated. The Aztecs, the Inca, the Mississippian cultures, many of them collapsed not because they were primitive, but because disease and conquest struck faster than they could adapt. Columbus didn't intend to unleash that catastrophe, but he became the face of it because his voyages opened the door. Leif Erikson's story feels cleaner. But maybe that's only because it didn't leave as much of a mark. If the Vikings had stayed, expanded, conquered, we might tell his story differently. We might debate whether he was a hero or a villain too. But because his colony disappeared, he becomes a figure of curiosity, not controversy, a man who came and went, leaving only faint traces behind. What this really shows is that history is not just about who arrived first, it's about who changed the future. And that's why Columbus, for better or worse, is remembered. His voyages started a world that looked more connected, more global, but also more unequal. They set into motion centuries of migration, war, slavery, resistance, and survival. So when we ask who really discovered America, maybe we should stop looking for a single name. Maybe the real answer is that America was discovered over and over again by the first humans who crossed the Bering Land Bridge, by the Norse explorers who found Vinland, by Columbus and every sailor after him. And each time, it was discovered not just by the newcomers, but by the people already there, who discovered that their world had changed forever. History books like heroes because heroes make the story easier to tell. But history is not easy. It's complicated, messy, and full of voices we rarely hear. The truth about America's discovery is that it was not one event, not one man, not one moment. It was a turning point that belongs to everyone. And that means it also carries everyone's pain and hope. And maybe that's why we still argue about Columbus and Erikson today. We aren't just arguing about who stepped ashore first, we're arguing about what kind of story we want to tell about ourselves. Is it a story of triumph and courage, or one of tragedy and loss? The truth is, it's both. And it always will be. So next time someone tells you Columbus discovered America, or that Erikson did it first, remember this: the discovery wasn't about planting a flag or finding a shore. It was about what came after, the exchange of people, ideas, and power that shaped the world we live in now. That story isn't over. It's still unfolding every time we question what we were taught and look for the voices left out of the textbooks.